What's up guys, you're watching LifeITCG. Got a video for you today on Pauper Tron. So the last time I did a video for this deck was quite a while ago, before MH2 even, and of course that was a very impactful set for Pauper with Chatterstorm and of course Sojourner's Companion. Meant that for a very long time Storm and Affinity was like the metagame basically of Pauper, but of course during that time Tron was like a little bit less successful. There were one or two like stalwart players still having some decent results with it, but in general it was like a far less popular deck. But of course Chatterstorm and Sojourner's Companion have been banned now, and now we sort of have to think, how are we going to build Tron, how are we going to play Tron in the new format and using some of these new cards that have been printed in the meantime. So of course we have the 12 Tron lands, and the next cards that I want to show you from the list, of course you have the typical like 4 of cards in Tron, just the like main consistency pieces. So I have 4 Impulse, 4 Mulldrifter, 4 Prophetic Prism, 4 Bonder's Ornament, and yeah, that's the main like core cards of the deck, right? Every Tron deck plays 4 of all of these cards just to like maximize consistency, but I'm arguing that there should be another card added to this category, which I haven't played in the deck before, and you'll understand why when you see it. It's 4 copies of Cleansing Wildfire. So this card has been quite popular in Pauper. When it was first released, the only thing you could do with it, well, some people thought you could use it like as a ghost quarter against non-basic lands. So like versus Tron, for example, maybe you could disrupt their mana base with it. And some people had the idea that like, okay, well, if you have Darksteel Citadel, the indestructible artifact land, you can target it with your Cleansing Wildfire, and then you get Rampant Growth plus draw a card, which is a very strong effect for 2 mana. But of course, there weren't really many. You could only play 4 indestructible lands, because Darksteel Citadel was the only one, so that plan was pretty inconsistent. But now with Modern Horizons 2, there are all of the bridge lands, so you can play many more lands that are indestructible, and also they help fix your colored mana as well. So that's a very big upgrade. Cleansing Wildfire is just generally a very powerful card for this archetype. So you might remember that previously the deck has, some versions of the Tron deck and Pauper have played like 2 mana artifacts. So like not Prophetic Prism, Prismatic Lens, and even sometimes like Simic Signet as well, just to help like ramp mana and make everything a bit more consistent. It doesn't compare exactly because those things are colorless. You can cast them off Tron lands, whereas Cleansing Wildfire, you need the colored source already. But for a deck that's trying to like cast its own Mulldrifters and stuff, having this spell, like 2 mana Rampant Growth draw a card, is like the perfect addition for the strategy. It just helps you like help things go more consistently, even in the games where you don't necessarily have all your Tron mana available yet. And even in the mid game where you might have like done all the ramping you need, it still just replaces itself, it cycles, which is also excellent compared to those cards like Prismatic Lens or Simic Signet, where when you were flooded and you drew them late, they just did nothing. And you also have the option of using it as that Ghost Quarter effect. Like in the late game when you have a flicker loop going, you can just keep returning Cleansing Wildfire and start sniping all their lands down. So that gives you like a win condition in the late game. And the other thing is that just in general, you can also use it as that effect. If you're playing, for example, the mirror match, like your opponent's also on Tron, then you can start targeting their Urza lands. Or if your opponent's playing like Pestilence or Boros or a deck that has bounce lands, you can get ahead that way as well by Cleansing Wildfire on their bounce land. So it's just a very pretty strong card for the deck. Now, of course, you have to wonder exactly like how do you adjust the mana base to accommodate the artifact lands. So I have the 12 Tron lands, of course, and I also have 4 of the blue-red bridge and 3 of the blue-green bridge. So 4 Silverbluff, 3 Tanglepool, and 3 Island. So I'm not playing Bojuka Bog, I'm not playing Thriving Isle, and I'm not playing any like Cave of Temptation. Like I do think 3 Island is basically like the minimum if you're playing 4 Wildfire. You could argue that maybe like one of the islands could be a different basic land, like perhaps a mountain or even a forest, but I think 3 islands is fine. And yeah, so when I was initially testing this deck, I only had 6 of the artifact lands. Like the last Tanglepool Bridge was either like a Bojuka Bog or a Cave of Temptation or something, but in the end I just decided to like make it slightly more consistent and just play 7. You don't really miss Bojuka Bog or like Cave of Temptation or anything that much, and like having the rainbow source from Thriving Isle hardly ever matters at all. Like the deck is so centric on the rug colors that this is fine. It does affect like your sideboard choices a little bit. Like for example, cards like Stonehorn Dignitary and Cast Down become a little bit more difficult to cast, so that's something to think about. But overall, I think the addition of Cleansing Wildfire is so strong that it's worth making those changes. So this is still 22 lands, which is the same number that the decks usually use. So you've seen the lands, you've seen those like staple cards, and there's another new addition from the most recent set, actually, the Innistrad Midnight Hunt, and that is Ardent Elementalist. So in the previous versions of the deck, of course, they have the late game based around the Flicker engine. So you have a creature that enters the battlefield and returns an instant or sorcery, then you flicker it and you return the flicker, plus you get value from whatever the second thing that you flickered, or you know, the same thing with Ephemerate. Like it's a very standard gameplay pattern at this point. You should probably, if you're watching this video, you should probably already know all about that. And of course the creature that the decks used to flicker was Mnemonic Wall, which is a 5 mana 0/4 defender creature. So now I'm playing Ardent Elementalist. So the most significant upgrade for Ardent Elementalist is the fact that it only costs 4 mana instead of 5. Of course, you could always technically do that because Archaeomancer always existed, but the problem with Archaeomancer, of course, is that it has a double colored symbol in the mana cost. So it costs 2 blue, rather than 4 and a blue of Mnemonic Wall. And the way that the mana base works with this deck of its overabundance of colorless sources is that Mnemonic Wall is just easier to cast than Archaeomancer. But now we have the Ardent Elementalist, which is a 4 mana creature with the Mnemonic Wall ability, but it only has 1 colored symbol in the mana cost. And even though it's not blue mana symbol, and because you'll think that like, well, with the island and the Tanglepool Bridge, you have like quite a lot more blue sources than red, but 1 mana discount from 5 to 4 is a big deal. And you do have like generally enough ways to cast this that I think the Ardent Elementalist is much better. Like for example, one sequence that's pretty easy to do and is very strong is you go like you make a play something like this. So you go like turn 1 Silverbluff Bridge, untap, turn 2 play a Tron land or whatever land, then you Wildfire your bridge, you get your third land, draw a card, then on turn 3 play another land, 4 mana, play the Elementalist, get the Wildfire back, and then next turn you can do it again, and you like have so much mana, and like you're not even down on cards because your Wildfire keeps replacing itself. Like a sequence like that, it just gets you on the board so much more quickly, and you start like accruing value much more easily than you would with mnemonic wall, just because with the discount. So the main downside of Elementalist, well, like I already mentioned the fact that it's red instead of blue, which can make it like very slightly harder to cast in some situations, but that's not a huge deal. The upside of it, another upside of Elementalist is that it can attack. So not only can it function as like another win condition, but you can like threaten to take the Monarch from your opponent with it, things like that. So that's quite useful. The main drawback of it, of course, is that, oh, sorry, another thing I mentioned when I talk about the color is that usually people don't generally bring in blue Elemental Blast versus Tron, but they obviously do bring in blue Elemental Blast because it stops your Mulldrifters as well, and your Flicker and whatever else. So you could, in one way, you could view it as like, well, this is exposing you to more types of blast. If your opponent's on like a deck that doesn't have red but they do have blue blast, then they can bring it in versus your Elementalist, and that might become an issue. But on the other hand, like you could say the deck is already like much weaker to red blast, so you're diluting that effect by playing more cards that don't get hit by red blast. So that's a little bit debatable, but I think in that sense adding the red card is maybe slightly better. The main downside of the Elementalist is that it only has 1 toughness, so that can be a problem. Like now your Flicker combo can be disrupted by like Lightning Bolt, for example, whereas it couldn't before, because you can't bolt a mnemonic wall obviously because it has 4 toughness instead of 1. So that's just something you have to watch out for. But generally, like if your opponent is burning removal spells on your Elementalists, then you should be doing pretty well in the game anyway. You have the Pulse of Murasa in the deck to get them back and just for free, and then you have like the counter spells to protect them if your opponent wants to fight on that axis as well. So yeah, Elementalist instead of Mnemonic Wall. The 1 mana discount is pretty important, and I think it upgrades the deck somewhat significantly. So I'll get into the rest of the spells just quickly. So yeah, the 3 Elementalists. The rest of the Flicker package is basically 1 Flicker, Ephemerate, and the 2 Mystical Teachings. So in the past, like sometimes I've played 2 Flickers. It's a little bit clunky to draw a Flicker in a situation where it's not that useful. Like you can Flicker your Prophetic Prism in a situation where you don't have a Elementalist, or you can just like Flicker your Urza's Tower or something to get the mana back. But overall, it's not that impactful. I think it's better to just play 1 Flicker in the deck and then tutor for it when you need it. And of course, you do have the 1 Ephemerate as well. The thing to remember is that when you add the 4 Cleansing Wildfire, you have to find space to like trim stuff to make room for it, because you're just adding like 4 copies of this card. That's like sort of like a generic consistency thing. So you can't really cut like, you don't want to cut like Impulse or something for it, because that would just make the deck too inconsistent. So you have to find something to cut, and like 1 Ghostly Flicker is like a very reasonable spot for that. Some people play like 3 Mystical Teachings as well, but I rather have the 3 Elementalist. I think like having that kind of card at 4 mana is more powerful. You want to double up on the Elementalist for like your late game, and yeah, I think like 3 Teachings is okay, but I don't think it's necessary. And like I said, you need space for wildfires. So then, in terms of, so then you have like one crop rotation and one Pulse of Murasa. Both of these are like absolutely essential. Very like standard cards for Tron. In terms of defensive cards, I have 2 Moments Peace, 1 Tangle, and 1 Weather the Storm. I think like you probably want to have like the 4 defensive cards still. Some people don't like playing Weather the Storm main deck, but I like having access to that. And yeah, the 1 Tangle probably can look like a bit of a meme as well, but like if you wanted to play like 3 Moments Peace and a Weather the Storm, or 4 Moments Peace or something like that in the slot, that would be fine as well. But this is just the combination that I like, having the 3 Fog with 1 Tangle and the Weather the Storm as well. Then counterspells, I have 1 Dispel, 1 Memory Lapse, 1 Prohibit. So these are just like the most efficient, most efficient counterspells available. Generally, you want like cheaper cards that are like easier to trade, because it makes it easier to find spots to use them when you're casting your Elementalists. Like it's relatively easy to, for example, like you have 5 mana, you play an Elementalist with one mana behind, and you have your Dispel up, compared to playing a card like Unwind, for example. Like overall, I think playing, like after some experience trying like different configurations, I think playing those 3 mana counterspells like Exclude as well, for example, it's just a little bit too greedy. Like when you are firing on all cylinders, you generate so much value that you don't have to really sort of worry about that kind of like nickel and dimey, like find a +1 here and there kind of gameplay. Like you just want to make sure that your engine gets online and your opponent can't disrupt it. So a card like Dispel that's only 1 mana is a lot more desirable than an effect like Unwind, for example, even though they're both counter like non-creature spells, basically. And yeah, Memory Lapse, kind of important, not only just as like a 2 mana counterspell that only has 1 colored symbol that can target anything, but putting spells on top is like somewhat valuable, and we'll talk about that in a sec. And yeah, Prohibit is just like the most generic 2 mana counter. Can hit like relatively anything. So yeah, that's that situation. So the last 2 cards, I have 1 Compulsive Research and 1 Abrade, and I think this is okay, but one thing that I would consider swapping this to is playing 1 Lightning Bolt and 1 Wilt. So the Compulsive Research used to be good, firstly as like a win condition where you could use it to mill out your opponent in games versus like Elves, where they gain a ton of life while you foglock them, and you can't really win by attacking with Mulldrifters. So Compulsive Research was useful in that sense, but it was also pretty good to have in the deck just as like a 5th Mulldrifter, basically. Like in past versions of the deck, they often played cards like Seagate Oracle or Forbidden Alchemy, cards like that, just to have like extra Mulldrifters essentially. And you know, Compulsive Research was like fine in that role as well. So doing the dual purpose of like being a sort of card advantage consistency thing, plus like a sort of backdoor win condition, was why you wanted to play it. Having the role of the 5th Mulldrifter is much less needed now, because you have the extra velocity of the wildfires to draw through your deck quickly. So like you find what you need more reliably now that you have these cards to cantrip and thin your deck much more quickly. So having the 5th Mulldrifter essentially is much less necessary. You're going to be able to find an actual Mulldrifter or like play Elementalist to get an Impulse back or something, because that's much easier now because it costs you 1 less mana than it did before. So yeah, so that's a bit less necessary. And the Abrade is like fine. Having the removal plus the option to destroy artifacts is quite good in the mirror match versus like Bonder's Ornaments and things like that. And it can be okay versus Affinity as well, because like destroying their Mirror Enforcer or whatever, but that's like not usually the kind of play pattern that you want to execute versus that deck anyway. So what I would seriously consider instead playing in the main deck is, instead of a Braid and a Compulsive Research, I would make this a Wilt and a Lightning Bolt. So Wilt, like, I think having the option of artifact and enchantment destruction in the main deck is quite valuable, because the thing that I sort of realized after talking with a few like expert players is that playing cards like Dinrover Horror and Rolling Thunder is just kind of unnecessary. Like there is a sort of fine line between like, is that card training wheels versus like, is it actually helping you win the game? And like in a lot of matchups, cards like Dinrover Horror or Rolling Thunder are not actually that good. Especially considering things like when you're playing against like efficient decks, like the most popular ones like Affinity and Fairies, for example. Like Rolling Thunder can be like kind of okay, but like Dinrover Horror is generally like too expensive. Like it's just not the kind of place you want to be. So yeah, so that's why I'm not playing any of those like expensive finishes. Having the Bolt in the deck is just having like another way to interact. There's only 1 mana, similar to the argument I gave for like the Dispel. Like you can like play the Elementalist with like 1 more mana source left, and then like return your Lightning Bolt and then play it. It just gives you a little bit more flexibility. In like the late game, if you want to have like a faster win condition, then spending 4 mana on like a Flicker Loop with a Lightning Bolt does 3 damage, which is not that much worse than like pumping all your mana into a Rolling Thunder to kill the opponent. Of course, like it costs you a lot of colored sources and everything, but like it's not out of the range of insanity, and you only really care about that when you're trying to like win quickly in the clock anyway. So it does that function, and this also just acts as like having a cheap removal, which you do probably want to have access to in some regard. Just to have a way to pressure opponents, like familiars, for example, like both the black one and the white one form like relatively popular strategies right now. So I still think the deck definitely wants to have that effect in the main deck somewhere. And if you cut the Abrade for like Wilt, then you have no more removal available. So I just think that like having the Bolt could be a good option. Like another possible split is like Wilt plus like Fire Ice, which gives you like even more flexibility in the situation where like your opponent doesn't have any good targets for Lightning Bolt. But I'm not too sure whether like not being able to kill things that have 3 toughness is a little bit of an issue, like versus Axebane Guardian and like Sunscape Familiar and stuff. And then also just the fact that it costs 2 mana rather than 1 is a little bit sketchy as well. So yeah, But the reason why you don't need to play the compulsive research is because if you get a flicker loop going, you can memory lapse your own spells to prevent yourself from decking. So if you're in like a fog lock situation versus elves, like you just have to wait them out basically. And again, like if you're playing online, for example, you probably have to get like quite good at executing that quickly and making sure you can play fast. But I think like it's worth not playing the compulsive research because it's just not necessary anymore to have so many card draw effects in the deck when you have the 4 wildfires. So yeah, that's my stance on that. In terms of the sideboard, like it's probably not that different to the lists that you've played in the past. Like one thing that you probably want to think about is like with a list like this where you have 2 Moments Peace and like a Tangle like this in the main deck. In the past, when I've played a config like this, I played 2 Stonehorn Dignitary in the side, and you probably don't want to, well, I don't know, I wouldn't say that you don't want to play those, but you want to consider maybe playing like the 2 other Moments Piece in the sideboard instead, because like getting the white mana for your Stonehorn is a little bit harder now when you don't have Thriving Isle and you have all the artifact lands instead. So that's something to think about. And the other thing is that like the cast down is also a little bit harder to cast for the same reason. So a lot of Tron decks used to play a card like that in the sideboard to kill like Axebane Guardians versus those kind of decks. But if you want, you can just play like Inside Out instead, or like extra lightning bolts or something like that. The one thing that cast down was good against that was something you were sometimes concerned about was like Ulamog's Crusher, but like basically nobody's playing that card anymore, so maybe you don't really have to worry about it. Most things die to like lightning bolt, or you can play even like Flame Slash or something like that instead if you wanted, without too much issue. So yeah, the other thing is that the fact that the Elementalist only has 1 toughness means that it dies to Fiery Cannonade, so you don't really want to play that effect main deck anymore. But that can be like a sideboard option as well if you want, because it's still pretty strong versus a bunch of different decks. Or if you want, you could play like Suffocating Fumes instead, but again, that's a black card, so it's a little bit harder to cast. This is just something you have to be a little bit careful of. So yeah, the rest of the sideboard is probably like very similar to what previous versions were. You just have a bunch of like Pyro and Hydroblasts, and then like 2 Fogs, then like a Negate, and maybe whatever, yeah. Another card you can consider playing like either main or side is maybe Capsize, but like every time I add that card to the deck, it just is very unimpressive and like slow and not really what you want to be doing. Like usually it's too clunky game 1, like you have better things to be doing, and then after sideboard people are ready to fight over stuff like that because they've brought in all their Pyroblasts and stuff versus you anyway. So yeah, that's like a cool card, but probably not a very good one. Yeah. So yeah, I think basically what I've showed you here, except these 2 cards, probably swap for like a Wilt and a Lightning Bolt, or a Wilt and a Fire Ice. I think that's something that I'd be pretty much happy to do. But those are like the 2 slots where I'm still a little bit undecided. I'm mostly happy about everything else except maybe the like split of counterspells. But I think like Prohibit, Lapse, Dispel is like a pretty strong mix. Yeah, but like so apart from these 5 is what I'd be definitely the most confident in terms of the main deck. So I'll just quickly run through it just to end the video. The creatures, we have the 3 Elementalist and the 4 Mulldrifters. Then the lands, we have, let's play the game of figuring out what each land is based on the picture. So 4 Urza's Mine, Power Plant, Tower, Tower, Power Plant, Tower, Mine, Tower, Power Plant, Power Plant. So yeah, some people think like it's a very common, like relatively common opinion on like Reddit and like that kind of forum that it's like angle shooting to play cards in foreign languages. And of course that would be like, if you had that belief already, it would already seem like even more cheesy to do it with like Tron lands having all the different artworks. But like I don't understand that idea at all. Like when you're playing competitively, you just assume that your opponent knows what all your cards do anyway, right? Like I'm not looking to get an advantage by like bamboozling my opponent because I just assume that they are already competent anyway. So it's just this funny thing to me. I always feel a bit confused whenever I read that sentiment, but you can let me know whether you agree or disagree with that. 4 Silverbluff Bridge, 3 Tanglepool Bridge, 3 Island. Okay, there's no reason in Pauper to play Snow. I guess if you go turn 1 Island, turn 1 Snow Island, you bluff that you're playing like Scred Fairies or whatever, but that's extremely marginal. Then Artifacts. 4 Bonder's Ornament, 4 Prophetic Prism, and Instants, 4 Impulse, 1 Crop Rotation, 1 Pulse of Murasa, 2 Mystical Teachings, 1 Ephemerate, 1 Ghostly Flicker, 2 Moments Peace, 1 Tangle, 1 Weather the Storm, more instants, 1 Dispel, 1 Memory Lapse, 1 Prohibit, and what I think these should be is 1 Wilt and 1 Lightning Bolt. And then for sorceries we just have the 4 Cleansing Wildfire. So yep, that's the deck as it is right now. I think you know, the Wildfire and the Elementalist are quite separate innovations. Like I described the sequence where you know, like you curve perfectly from like turn 2 Wildfire into turn 3 Elementalist, getting the Wildfire back, and of course that's quite strong. But like for example, you could decide that, oh yeah, I quite like the Wildfire idea, I will adopt that, but I will keep using Mnemonic Wall because I want my Flicker combo to avoid Lightning Bolt. Or you could say like, the Wildfire idea, I'm not so on board with that, because one thing that I didn't mention is that a lot of people are playing cards that exile artifacts now, because firstly because Affinity is so popular in general, but also because like there are Wildfire decks out there. So like if you try and Wildfire your own land and your opponent like Shattering Blows in response to exile your artifact land, that's like a huge problem basically. So you could say that like, well, I'm not convinced about the Wildfire because it seems a bit inconsistent and I don't want the vulnerability by having all my stuff be artifacts, but I do like the idea of having like a cheaper Mnemonic Wall, and I'm going to move forward with my Tron list using those instead of mnemonics. So like there are two like separate things. They're not necessarily intrinsically connected, although I do think they sort of do work well together, because yeah, just when you have cheaper mnemonic walls, you want to play them early, or you can play them earlier, which means that you want to also have more like generic, like proactive spells that you can play in the deck. So with a build like this, like by the time you cast a Elementalist on like turn 4, it's very easy to have already played like an Impulse or a Wildfire, and you can get value off it immediately. Whereas if those were like crop rotations or like more expensive spells, like a mystical teachings or something, then you wouldn't necessarily be able to do that sequence on curve. So that's just one thing to consider. But yeah, I think I've probably gone over all the points basically at this stage, and the video is getting kind of long, so I'll end it here. This has been Li-Fi TCG, Pauper Tron, signing out.